On June 4, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump signed an executive order increasing tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from all countries except the United Kingdom from 25% to 50%. This move was intended to protect the domestic steel industry from unfair competition and global overcapacity. However, the decision has sparked mixed reactions. American automakers, such as General Motors, GM, and Ford, have warned about the negative impact of these tariffs on their profits and supply chains. GM estimates it will lose between $4 to $5 billion in 2025 due to the tariffs, with around $2 billion of that linked to imports from South Korea. The steel import tariffs have increased raw material costs for U.S. steel producers. Steel mills are facing higher prices for imported steel, particularly from countries like Canada and Europe. As a result, the price of domestically produced steel has also risen, making U.S. steel products more expensive in the international market. Specific data. According to a report from Reuters, steel costs have increased by 6%, which translates to an increase of $54.60 to $72.80 per ton over the past year, mainly due to tariffs and raw material shortages. This has not only affected the steel industry, but also had a ripple effect on other sectors such as automotive, construction, and energy. Steel is a crucial component in automobile production, accounting for approximately 70% of the weight of each vehicle. The increase in steel tariffs has raised production costs, especially for vehicles that use thicker steel such as trucks and SUVs. Specific data. Automotive industry experts report that the price increase of steel has raised the production cost of each vehicle by between $1,000 and $2,000, depending on the type of vehicle and the amount of steel used. Impact on vehicle prices. Automakers have been forced to raise vehicle prices to offset the higher raw material costs. For example, Ford had to raise the price of some models, such as the Ford F-150 and Mustang, by up to $2,000. General Motors, GM, adjusted its SUV and truck lines by reducing certain features like support systems, metal trim parts, or altering vehicle structures, such as the frame or load-bearing components, shifting from thicker steel to lighter steel or other materials like aluminum alloys or composites. This helped mitigate the steel cost increases while maintaining the vehicle's durability and safety. Reduced production and market share losses. With increased production costs and unstable steel supply, the U.S. automotive industry has faced a reduction in production and lost market share in international markets. U.S. automakers have had to cut domestic vehicle production. Ford has had to reduce production by about 10% for its truck and SUV models, equating to a cut of around 50,000 vehicles in Q2 2025, due to steel and parts shortages. General Motors, GM reduced production by about 5% in Q2 2025, which is roughly 25,000 fewer vehicles from its SUV and truck lines due to the steel shortage and supply chain disruptions. Overall, U.S. automotive industry. The U.S. automotive sector is estimated to have reduced production by a total of 250,000 vehicles in Q2 2025 due to the steel shortage and the lack of critical components. Steel is an essential material in construction, used in projects ranging from residential homes to large-scale infrastructure developments. The increase in tariffs on imported steel has raised the cost of this raw material for construction companies, leading to higher project costs. Specific data. A study from the American Construction Institute estimates that the increase in steel tariffs could raise construction costs by up to 10%. Specifically for large projects like bridges and highways, this increase could add up to $10 million for every $100 million worth of construction. This could put significant pressure on budgets and project timelines for critical infrastructure. Impact on the American public. Rising home prices. According to a report from Reuters, the average home price has increased by 2.9% year over year, reaching $401,800 in June 2025. This price increase makes it more difficult for many middle-income families to afford a home. Increased rent costs. Construction companies facing higher costs and an unstable steel supply have been forced to raise rent prices or delay new housing projects. According to Reuters, the rise in rent prices has increased the cost of living for people, particularly in large urban areas. Impact on public projects. Project delays. The shortage and price increase of steel have slowed the progress of construction projects. For example, Bechtel Construction Company estimates that a 10% increase in steel prices has added an additional 2-3 months to the completion time of large projects like bridges and highways. Job losses. Project delays have led to fewer job opportunities in the construction industry and related sectors. Each month of delay could result in the loss of 1,000 to 2,000 jobs on large-scale projects. The U.S. tariff policies on steel have directly affected the energy sector, particularly renewable energy, as steel is a key material in constructing wind turbines, solar panels, and energy infrastructure. Increased costs for renewable energy projects. Energy companies are facing higher costs when constructing wind turbines and solar power facilities. PwC estimates that the cost of renewable energy could increase by $53 billion annually due to the steel tariffs. Supply chain disruptions. Energy companies are also dealing with disruptions in the steel supply chain. The shortage of high-quality steel has delayed projects and increased costs. Equinor, for example, had to report a loss of $955 million due to the rising cost of steel and supply chain disruptions. Amidst the tense tariff situation, Canada has turned the challenge into an opportunity, reduced exports to the U.S. Although Canada accounts for 22% of total U.S. steel imports, the tariffs have reduced steel exports to the U.S. As a result, Canada has sought alternative markets, increasing exports to Asia and Europe, and reducing its reliance on the U.S. increased domestic production. Canada has ramped up its domestic steel production and made significant investments in green steel, aiming to lower production costs and attract investment from the renewable energy sector. On July 16, 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a series of measures to protect and strengthen the domestic steel industry in response to the U.S. increasing tariffs on steel and aluminum to 50% for all countries except the United Kingdom. Canada will implement a tariff quota on steel imports from countries with free trade agreements, FTAs, excluding the U.S. specifically. If steel imports exceed the level of 2024, the tariff will increase to 50%. For countries without an FTA, Canada will reduce the tariff-free quota by half compared to 2024 levels and apply a 50% tariff on steel imports exceeding this quota. Canada will impose an additional 25% tariff on steel imports from all countries excluding the U.S. if the steel contains components that are melted and poured in China. This measure aims to prevent cheap steel from China from being re-exported to Canada through other countries to bypass the tariffs. The Canadian government has announced the establishment of a $1 billion Canadian investment fund to support innovation and the development of the domestic steel industry. This fund will be used to finance projects focused on innovation, increasing productivity, and reducing carbon emissions in the steel sector. Additionally, Canada will prioritize the use of domestically produced steel in infrastructure, defense, and energy projects. The measure imposing an additional tariff on steel containing components from China has sparked a strong reaction from Beijing. The Chinese embassy in Ottawa criticized this move, stating that it violates World Trade Organization (WTO) rules and disrupts the international trade order. China has warned that it will take retaliatory measures if Canada does not retract these measures. Who benefits when the U.S. imposes a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum from Canada? It's not the U.S. and it's not the industrial sector. It's actually Canada. Sounds counterintuitive. But the numbers don't lie. Since Herbert Hoover's administration with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, the U.S. has experimented with tariff policies to protect domestic production. And the result? It pushed the world into the Great Depression. Nearly a century later, Donald Trump revived that weapon, sweeping tariffs on most trading partners, from China to close allies like Canada and the European Union. In early 2025, Trump signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on all imported steel and aluminum, including from Canada, the U.S. top supplier. This move is a continuation of the America First policy from the early part of his previous term, but this time it is broader, longer-lasting, and more aggressive. The consequence? A blow not only aimed at opponents, but also turning back to taxing itself. Tariffs may be an attractive political slogan, but they are a dangerous economic tool when used incorrectly. In Q2 of 2025, according to data from the U.S. Department of Commerce, the average import price for construction steel rose by 17%, and aluminum by 23% compared to the same period last year. This price increase spread to consumer goods. From beer cans to car parts, everything saw a price hike. According to research by the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the tariffs imposed since 2018 have caused the U.S. to lose a net 300,000 manufacturing jobs due to increased input costs and disrupted supply chains. This version of Trump's 2025 tariffs is even worse. U.S. automakers like Ford and Stellantis have cut production, with Stellantis halting its Illinois assembly line and laying off 900 workers, according to an internal announcement on June 3, 2025. As for consumers, they are the ones who bear the final tax. The price of imported light trucks has increased by 6.8%, and the price of household appliances rose by 3.5% in the first quarter, according to Bloomberg Economics Consumer Price Report in June 2025. Trump believed that imposing tariffs on Canada would force Ottawa to back down. But the reality is quite the opposite. Canada's economy has not only remained resilient, but has adapted and is benefiting. The latest data from Statistics Canada, released on July 5, 2025, shows that Canada's unemployment rate dropped to 6.9% in June 2025, the lowest in 15 months. In the same month, 83,000 new jobs were created, with the majority in the provinces of Quebec, British Columbia, and Ontario, areas with strong service, tourism, and construction sectors. The reason isn't exports, it's consumer behavior. Canadians have changed the way they spend their money. In the past, Canadians often traveled to the U.S. on weekends, shopping at outlets, dining out, and vacationing in border states. But now, with U.S. prices rising due to tariffs and the unfavorable exchange rate between the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar, the money is staying in Canada. A June 2025 survey by Nanos Research found that more than 70% of Canadians have reduced the frequency of trips to the U.S., while nearly 64% prioritize shopping and traveling domestically. The result? Domestic tourism has boomed. In Montreal and Ottawa, hotels reported a more than 10% increase in room occupancy compared to the same period last year. Restaurants saw revenue rise by nearly 9%. Canadians are spending locally, creating jobs, increasing taxes, and helping Canada grow thanks to U.S. tariff policies. Quebec used to be a province heavily reliant on exporting aluminum and electricity to the U.S. When Trump imposed tariffs, many feared Quebec would suffer significant losses. But that didn't happen. According to Banque Nationale du Canada, Quebec's GDP grew by 0.5% in Q1 of 2025, an unexpected result. Instead of complaining, Quebec restructured. Businesses shifted their exports to Europe and Asia. The provincial government launched a support package of 1.8 billion KD to help small businesses pivot to new markets and upgrade technology. A factory in Sherbrooke, once producing components for the U.S., has now signed new contracts with South Korea. No need for Washington, and no longer dependent. If you compare the US and Canada side by side in Q2 of 2025, you'll see two economic models moving in opposite directions in the same context at the same time, but with entirely different outcomes. In the US, the unemployment rate is slightly rising to 4.8%, as manufacturing industries cut costs, scale down, and some factories are even forced to temporarily halt production due to soaring input costs. Meanwhile, to the north, Canada recorded a significant drop in unemployment, falling to 6.9%, the lowest in 15 months. This isn't due to luck, but rather the result of a clear adjustment in spending behavior and a strategic push for domestic growth. In the US, the cost of imported goods increased by 5% to 17%, shrinking household spending. Daily, Americans are forced to buy less or opt for cheaper products, if they even have a choice. In contrast, prices in Canada have remained relatively stable, especially for domestic products. Canadians haven't just maintained their spending levels, they've even increased domestic spending, particularly in the service sectors, from tourism to dining out and entertainment. Take the hospitality and restaurant industries as an example. In U.S. border states like New York and Michigan, revenues from Canadian tourists have sharply declined, leading to reduced hotel bookings and local spending. On the other hand, in Quebec, Ontario, and British Columbia, the service industry is growing beyond expectations. Part of this growth is driven by domestic tourists, and part is the result of money flowing back from Canadians who were once accustomed to spending in the U.S. As for economic growth, the U.S. reported a modest 0.1% increase in Q2, just on the brink of a technical recession. Meanwhile, Quebec grew by 0.5% and British Columbia by 0.3%, showing that Canadian provinces are maintaining their growth momentum even under U.S. tariffs. Two countries, two strategies. One side erects tariff walls, facing imported inflation, production cuts, and job losses. The other is hit by tariffs but responds by holding on to money, adjusting the domestic market and growing from the shock. This contrast is not accidental. It's the inevitable outcome of how each country chose to respond to a trade blow. Tariffs by nature are not a tool for creating value. They are merely a shield used to buy time. But if you use it too long, too broadly, and against the wrong targets, that shield will end up blocking your own path to growth. That's exactly what's happening in the U.S. In an effort to project strength to voters with easily digestible numbers, like we're hitting foreign imports, the Trump administration is trading long-term economic stability for short-term political gain, because behind the guise of protecting domestic production lies a political calculation. Tariffs aren't just aimed at Canada or Europe. They're targeted at industrial states struggling with unemployment where Trump needs votes. But the price is steep. U.S. businesses, from automotive to refrigeration, are struggling with rising costs, while American consumers have to dig deeper into their wallets every month for things they once bought cheaply. On the other hand, Canada, instead of responding with anger, has chosen a smarter strategy, redirecting internal resources. Rather than continue relying on the U.S. market, they've strengthened their multilateral trade agreements, stimulated domestic consumption, and adjusted supply and demand within their own borders. The result? A more flexible, less vulnerable economy, now even growing from the very blows dealt by the U.S. The lesson here is clear. In a globalized economy, you cannot isolate yourself without paying the price. A poorly designed trade blow will not weaken your opponent, it will only expose your own vulnerabilities. And if you choose to use tariffs as a political tool, be ready to explain why the prices of meat, cars, steel, and even the number of lost jobs are rising every day. Potash, a resource that not everyone pays attention to, plays a critical role in global agriculture. It's helping Canada strengthen its position and counteract U.S. tariff policies, especially in the context of President Donald Trump imposing a 35% tariff on goods from Canada. Potash is a vital mineral in fertilizer production, especially for providing potassium, an essential nutrient for crops. Potash not only boosts agricultural productivity, but is also a key factor in global food security. With over 40% of global potash production coming from Canada, it's an indispensable resource in global agriculture. Canada produces about 16 million tons of potash annually, mainly from Saskatchewan, home to the largest potash mine in the world. In 2023, Canada accounted for about 41% of total global potash output, which is a staggering number. Meanwhile, the U.S. is Canada's largest market, importing more than 5 million tons of potash each year, representing about 79% of U.S. potash imports. Thus, the U.S. dependence on Canada has adopted a smart strategy in these negotiations, starting by showing resolve and a willingness to face U.S. tariffs without hastily retaliating directly. Prime Minister Mark Carney and other Canadian leaders understood that in a globalized world, they couldn't respond to U.S. moves by undermining long-standing economic and trade relationships. Instead, they decided to cleverly leverage strategic resources like potash as a bargaining chip. Canada's use of potash as a strategic tool to deal with U.S. tariffs could have widespread and severe impacts on the U.S. economy, particularly in agriculture. Potash, a key component in fertilizers, directly influences crop yields and agricultural production costs. Rising fertilizer costs, direct impact on U.S. farmers, increase in potash fertilizer prices. If Canada reduces potash exports, the supply of potash to U.S. agriculture will drop significantly. A shortage of potash will lead to sharp price hikes for fertilizers, forcing U.S. farmers to pay higher prices for this key agricultural input. This price hike could range from 30 to 50%, depending on how much the supply is disrupted. A study by the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, indicates that fertilizer costs account for about 20 to 30% of production costs for major crops like corn, wheat, and soybeans. When fertilizer prices rise, it increases the overall production cost for farmers, with corn production costs expected to rise by $75 to $125 per acre, wheat by $90 to $150 per acre, reducing profitability and competitiveness of U.S. crops. Higher agricultural production costs. Potash is crucial for maintaining crop yields. If farmers can't afford potash fertilizer at reasonable prices, they will have to reduce its use, leading to decreased crop yields. A study by the U.S. Agricultural and Resource Economics Institute shows that 1 ton of potash fertilizer can increase crop yields by 20 to 40% for crops like corn and wheat. If the potash supply is disrupted, yields will fall dramatically, affecting not only production but also raising the cost per unit of agricultural products. Higher costs for consumers in the food market. Rising food prices as production costs for farmers increased, and food processing companies will reflect those price hikes in retail prices, particularly corn and soybean, which are essential in animal feed and food processing, will see significant price increases. According to a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a 1% increase in potash fertilizer prices could cause food prices to rise by up to 0.5% the following year. This could fuel food inflation, especially for low-income households. Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Higher commodity prices. With reduced crop yields, prices for commodities like corn, soybeans, and wheat will rise, impacting consumers and industries that rely on these raw materials such as food processing, livestock, and biofuel production. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, fertilizer costs can make up 15 to 30% of the total production cost for key crops. If these costs skyrocket, farmers may struggle to produce at the current price levels and will need to raise product prices to maintain profitability. USDA. Impact on retailers. Retailers, especially those distributing food and essential consumer goods, will face higher costs when importing and selling agricultural products. Basic food price hikes. Essential items like bread, cereals, meat, and processed foods made from corn and wheat will see price increases. Major retailers like Walmart, Target, and large supermarket chains will pass these price hikes on to consumers. A study by the USDA shows that corn prices could rise by 10 to 20% when fertilizer prices surge. Specific price increases. Assuming fertilizer prices rise by 30 to 50% due to potash supply disruptions, the price hikes for food would look like this. Corn. If corn production costs $1,000 per acre and fertilizer accounts for about 20 to 30% of this cost, that is $200, $300 per acre, a 30 to 50% rise in fertilizer costs could lead to a price increase of $60 to $150 per acre. Wheat production costs about $1,200 per acre, with fertilizer accounting for 25% or $300 per acre. A 30 to 50% increase in fertilizer costs could result in a price increase of $90 to $150 per acre. Soybeans. Soybean production costs about $700 per acre, with fertilizer making up 25% or $175 per acre. A 30 to 50% price hike in fertilizer would lead to a price increase of $52.50 to $87.50 per acre. Food price increases and their impact on consumers. Food inflation. According to the USDA, food costs account for about 13% of total household spending in the U.S. When food prices increase due to higher fertilizer costs, consumers will have to spend more on basic products. A 1% rise in fertilizer prices could increase food prices by up to 0.5% the following year, affecting household budgets, and especially for low-income families. Increased food inflation. For example, if corn prices rise by 10%, the price of bread, cereals, and corn-based products will follow suit. This not only affects the cost of living, but also increases food inflation, forcing families to cut back on spending in other areas. When the price of corn rises, the production costs of corn-based products such as breakfast cereals, bread, snacks, and animal feed will also increase. This leads to higher prices for essential food items, directly affecting household budgets, especially for middle and low-income families. According to a report by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a 1% increase in potash fertilizer prices could lead to a 0.5% increase in food prices the following year. This could contribute to higher food inflation, particularly for low-income households. Bread, snack, and other corn-based products. Bread, snacks, and other corn-based products are essential items in daily diets. When corn prices increase, the production costs of these products also rise, leading to higher retail prices. This directly impacts the cost of living, forcing households to cut back on spending in other areas such as education, healthcare, and other essential needs. Carney has successfully turned potash into an effective negotiation tool in the trade standoff with the U.S. rather than directly retaliating with punitive measures. He cleverly leveraged U.S. dependence on potash as a bargaining chip to increase economic pressure on the U.S., while safeguarding Canada's interests in trade talks. This is a masterful strategy that allows Canada to stay in control during trade conflicts without incurring major losses. A shortage of potash will lead to sharp price hikes for fertilizers,